Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Rock Bottom Airsoft. It's good to see you again, and if it's your first time here, as always, it is good to see you. We're back on another tech video. I did do a previous video on the SRC G36 and how to strip it down to the gearbox, so you could get at the gearbox if you were going to do any gearbox work. Here we have the version 3 gearbox from the SRC G36. If you wanted to see the video on how to strip it down to the gearbox, I will put a link in the description as to my previous video on how to get to this point. And then watch through that one, we get to the gearbox, and next we're going to look at opening the gearbox up and seeing what we find. Your guess is as good as mine. Now, we'll go through it together. Version 3 gearbox, as many of you will know, is not what you'll find in an AR replica. You'll normally find them in G36s. You will normally find them in AK replicas as well. But the version 3 box, I like it. It's a strong gearbox normally. There's a lot of parts available for it. And the fact that the motor cage is integral, and you can remove that separately, does make adjustments much easier. You don't have to put the whole replica to any state of being back together before you can test your shim job or your motor height adjustment. Much better from that point of view. Okay, now one thing before we start, I don't know particularly why, but it's solid on the back of the gearbox. Normally, if you were working on a version 2 or indeed on other G36 version 3s I've worked on, you'd normally have a hole in the back here where you can see the reverse of the spring guide, which comes in very handy for when you're dismantling, because you can put a hole punch or a small screwdriver into that hole through the back to hold the spring, the main spring and spring guide in place while you dismantle the gearbox. We don't have that option with this gearbox, unfortunately. So we're going to have to play it by here. But what I would say is when we crack the gearbox, we maybe crack it very gently, very carefully, because we do not want that main spring to come flying out and everything to go flying everywhere. So the way around that is we'll crack it partially, and then we'll try and get something in the back there to hold the mainspring in place. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to take this gearbox apart. The first thing we need to do is to remove this top plate here. You won't have that on a version 2 gearbox. In fact, you mainly find it on version 3s. The Steyr AUG, things like that will have one of these. So first things first, we need to remove that from the top. If it doesn't come off easily like mine did there, all you have to do is get a screwdriver at the back here in that little hole and push or give it a tap until it moves forward. So we can put that to one side, so that's that off. Next, we have a number of screws here that we need to take off. The first thing that I'm going to do is remove the motor cage, and then we can have a look at that. So these two screws here, they are part of the gearbox screw system, but they hold the motor cage in place. We'll go through this together with a bit with the motor cage, so you can get a feel for it. Now, one important thing to remember is these screws, in the vast majority of gearboxes I've worked on, they are very easy to strip, as in the head of the screw, this head here, is easy to strip out. So make sure you get a screwdriver bit that fits really well in there, that there's no slop in it, no play, and that it fits well. And press a bit of pressure as you start to undo the screw. That way you're going to avoid stripping the screw head. So the first two screws that we've removed to remove the motor cage is this screw here and this screw here. And then you fold backwards and away. And that is your motor and motor cage removed. Now if I have a look here myself, well, that motor seems solid. Seems like a good motor. So I think we're going to stick with that motor. It's got good strong magnets in it, which is good. You can always tell whether your magnets are good just by twisting the motor slightly, and if it turns with resistance, then it's a strong motor. That is a high torque motor, as standard in this SRC, so that's nice. So anyway, that's the motor separated away, which is great. Now, if you want to pull the tabs here, you can do, and that will remove the wiring from the motor, like so. but we don't really need to be honest. So we'll leave the motor connected for now, but that's just to show you that if you do want to remove them, they do just pull off. So we're going to leave that attached for now. Okay, now next, to actually get the gearbox apart, we're going to remove this screw, this screw. We're going to remove this screw as well, this screw, and this screw, and that should allow us to get into the motor. You can take this piece here at the top off, that's what holds it in place when it's in the body of the gun, but we really don't need to at this point. It's going to fall out when we crack the gearbox anyway, but we'll leave that in place for just now. Okay, so it's once more this screw here, this screw here, this screw here, this one, and this one. Okay, so I'll leave that with me. What will happen is this plate will come away like so. You've got a spring here you don't want to lose, and part of the cut off, which we keep together and then we don't lose them. The screw that holds that in place is just this very small screw, difficult to see, so we'll keep that with that. But that's nothing to do with the gearbox, but it just makes it easier if we take it off. You don't have to remove that if you don't want, but I like to remove it just to make the gearbox as small as possible when we're working on it, okay? Right, moving on. Just to say, guys, I am going to take this motor away as well so that we don't have any issues with the motor getting damaged. Okay, I'll come back to you. Okay guys, that's the last screw out. It's always worth holding the gearbox at this point. It can cause problems. What you might have noticed is there is also a clip here in the centre. That clip's going to have to come off. That is just a gear cover. We need to remove that clip, otherwise you are going to have problems taking the gearbox apart. So this clip here, you should be able to make out on camera. This black clip does need to come off. That should just flick off. They do have a nasty habit of breaking, which I've had happen before on a Steyr AUG, but once the clip is off you can put that to one side, and as you can see it just covers the gears. Looking at those, it looks like there's very little lubrication on there, which could be the reason this is running a little bit rough. So that's all of our screws out. Now at this point it's worth keeping hold of, as we don't want bits to go flying everywhere, and then when we come to the point of disassembly, we are going to have to prise this gearbox slightly to get it to open, because I suspect it's never been open. So we could either do that with brute force, as I am now, remembering to get something ready to catch this mainspring if it's going to go. Just prise gently. If you need to get something in between to prise, then do. You can use a flat-headed screwdriver for that. You are going to have stuff come flying out normally. So at this point you can see I've got the box partially open enough that I can get something in to hold that mainspring in place. And then very carefully we can remove the rest of the gearbox. There we go. Okay, now we can take the tension off the mainspring with the screwdriver. And there we go. That is the gearbox part. You probably noticed the section that we said would fall out has fallen out. Okay, and now we're into the gearbox. You can see that there's a lot of things under tension in there. Let's take the mainspring out, which seems to be stuck in our piston. Not a problem. Not a problem. Ooh, that's the anti-reversal that's just popped out. Try not to lose any shims, guys, when you're doing this. if there are shims. As you can see, there are shims on the gears. If you're not planning on re-shimming, try to keep the shims where they were. Sometimes you'll find that there'll be shims attached to your bushings, which in this case there doesn't appear to be. So try not to lose your shims, because you need them. You will find that there is a spring attached to your tappet plate, which you'll want out. I think what we'll do is we'll try and get this whole assembly out right. So there's the piston, spring and spring guide. In this particular one, it's all nylon, nylon piston, nylon spring guide. Main spring seems quite strong. That to one side. We'll have a look at that shortly. There's very little lubrication in here. Now at this point, you'll notice that the trigger assembly has fallen. If we can keep that where it is, that makes our job so much easier. But unfortunately, I'm going to be degreasing this gearbox and then re-greasing. So with that in mind, the trigger is undoubtedly going to fall out. Which I completely hate the trigger mechanisms on a version 3 gearbox. It is possibly the worst assembly to try and get back in. Some of you guys might find it easier if you're experienced at doing these. Me, I just absolutely hate doing it. But that's just me. So all we've done so far is we've taken the bevel gear out, and there are shims attached to that which we don't want to lose. We've taken the anti-reversal latch out, which sits here. There's your spur gear, there's your sector gear. Obviously we have a full cylinder on this replica. We have a tappet plate, we have our trigger unit with our contacts within, and that is the spring for the tappet plate. So it springs back and forth on that. Now we're going to want to take this assembly out, so with that in mind we'll need to remove that spring, so leave that with me. Okay, so that's your spring off. At this point we should be able to remove the cylinder, assembly and tappet plate as one unit. That's quite stiff. But there you go, so that's your tappet plate with the spring attached. You can leave that on there if you prefer. Tappet plate, yeah, that looks in good nick. Cylinder looks in good nick, and the cylinder head looks nice. So pop that to one side. Okay, so that leaves us with our trigger assembly, our trigger switch and follower. That will push into your contacts like so, and obviously that's all springing out at the moment. And then we have our gears, our sector gear and our cut-off lever. The sector gear has a shim on the bushing, and we can examine these gears, check that they're okay. So all I'm going to do here now is check the shimming, check the gears are in good condition, spray all this gearbox out with some degreaser, give it a good clean, reapply my own grease, which will hopefully make it run a lot smoother, and then we'll put it all back together and see how it shoots. So leave that with me. I'll come back to you when I've done all the cleaning, when I've done all my testing, and when I've put it all back together. But that is basically the method for stripping your gearbox down and getting down to it. If you want to strip the trigger, you can do. There's usually very little need to, because the contacts are accessible from the outside on this version 3 normally. So yeah, so there's not really any need to do that. Things to check out for: check your gears, check the teeth aren't worn, check your bushings, checking they aren't worn, check your gearbox shell for cracks, check the springs are in good condition, and also check compression. Now on this particular piston, the piston appears to be solid with the spring. You do find that on some replicas. I know some of the JG AUGs, the standard piston is one with the spring, as it were, so you can't just change the main spring out, you'd have to change the piston as well. But have a check of your piston. In this particular case, the teeth look absolutely fine, no problems at all. It is ported on the front, but it's only a plastic head, which there's nothing wrong with having a plastic head. If you were wanting to check compression, it's a bit tricky with this attached, but what you can do is remove your tappet plate, and then you take your piston carefully with the O-ring, and then you see how that won't move? Well, that is really, really good air seal. So the air seal components are good. Just do that again. You see, just push with your finger over the end of the nozzle. Do it with the nozzle on because you don't want your nozzle to be leaking, and that is excellent compression. I can't force that piston in there. So the compression on this system is awesome. So far, the only things I would say about this gearbox are changes. There's no MOSFET, which would be nice to have a MOSFET. Don't like the fact that this spring is attached to the piston, but the piston's good, the spring's got tension, so I don't think we need to change it. But again, a non-bearing nylon spring guide, that's destined for failure at some point. Spring guides that are made out of the nylon, they do tend to break. So if I have a version 3 spring guide, I'll probably change that out for a metal ball bearing one, but that is something we'll look into when I'm doing my upgrades. As I say, I'll clean all this out for now, and then we'll get down to it. Okay, I'll get back to you in a second. Right guys, we're back. I've put the gearbox back together, I've cleaned everything up, I've greased it. The grease that was in would be the only drawback with the system, I would say. I was quite pleased with the gearbox, as you saw. It was all metal, good quality components. Yeah, the gearbox was pretty good as standard. It's all back together now. It's all good to go. I didn't notice any cracks in the shell. None of the parts were broken. At first I thought the motor might be on its way out, but I think the grease that was in there that you might find if it's been in for a while, it had all gone very, very thick, and it was like red, cheap stuff that was really tacky, a bit like glue. I don't think it was doing it any good at all. So we've changed all that out, we've greased it all up with some fresh super lube is what I use. And I use any universal degreaser for degreasing components. Only use the degreaser on metal components, don't use them on plastic. The degreaser will degrade your plastics. So just keep the degreaser to metal, only use it on the metal. And then when you've done that, you can reapply grease. I'm not going to do a video on applying grease on this version 3. I've got some work to do on a version 2, and I'll show you the grease and re-shimming on that one. I didn't need to re-shim this one. Didn't really want to be honest, because it was very tight to start with. When I took the gearbox apart, there was only like one shim on some of the gears, so I think it's quite tight to start with. But you know, it did for what I intend to use it for. Shimming, I can do a video on shimming. There's loads of videos on shimming here on YouTube if you want to have a look at shimming. To be honest, I think it gets overcomplicated a lot. There's not really much to it. Just get it to a point, you close the gearbox up with maybe 3 screws in it, and just spin them by hand without the cylinder or spring in or anything like that in. See if they spin free. If they spin free and they're making good teeth contact, that's all you're aiming for in shimming. So this has had a fresh coat of grease applied. I've got my Titan lithium-ion 7.4 volt battery here with an adapter so it'll work on this mini Tamiya. This is one of the advantages of a version 3 box, is that we can test it without putting the box back in the gun. So let's see how she goes. It's a little bit whiny, like I say, a little bit whiny, but it is certainly snappy now, good trigger response, and I think that is because it was getting bogged down with a lot of grease, well, old grease. There was some very manky parts in there. I give it a good scrub out with my trusty old toothbrush. Lots of channels use the same sort of thing, but degreaser, toothbrush, scrub everything down, then give it a wipe over with some rag, and that'll get it cleaned up. Now, putting the gearbox back together, as you saw, it's very simple to take apart anyway. 2 screws here to take the motor cage off, then you remove this screw, this screw, this screw, and that screw if you want to take this assembly off, and this screw, slide this top plate off, and the gearbox comes apart. It wasn't as bad as I thought without the hole in the back here for holding down the spring guide. Just prise the gearbox apart ever so gently, and then get a small screwdriver in the back or a punch that'll fit in the back of the spring guide. Hold it down in place while you take the rest of the gearbox apart, and just keep hold of any shims that come out. So there you go. That's us stripped down a G36. That is us remove the gearbox. We've stripped the gearbox. I showed you how to take the gearbox apart. I hope that's been useful. Putting the gearbox back together, as I say, reverse of disassembly. And putting the actual replica back together, again, is the exact reverse of disassembly that we've already done. So I'm going to go away now and put this replica back together so that it's ready to go when I can use it in game. And we'll see how it gets on. But I'm impressed with that gearbox. I thought it was quite nice, apart from the piston and the spring being kind of welded together. But yeah, that worked great. One thing, as I've recommended before, get a set of these. A clip for holding the anti-reversal latch in place makes reassembly so much easier. You don't need it. I've found that these do make it a whole world easier, and for what they are, I think they're quite expensive, but they are worth it because they make it a lot easier. The only thing I would say as well is getting the trigger assembly back in to a version 3. I would have shown you how to do it, but I'll be completely honest with you, I haven't got a method for doing it. I haven't got a foolproof method. It's just a lot of playing around until you can get it to go back in there. You'll see what I mean when you do it. It's very fiddly and it's very hard to get back in. I know there's some good videos here on YouTube of guys that do have a method for doing it and they can get it back in every time. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them guys. I have to mess about with it quite a bit to get it back in. But we did get it back in. If you want to see any more on gearbox work, or if you'd like me to go more in depth, then let me know in the comments. I'll always reply to a comment. But again, I really hope you found it useful on stripping down a G36 version replica, opening the gearbox. I hope that's been useful for you. If it has been useful, then do drop a like on there for me. And if you're enjoying my series of videos, then please do subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss any of my uploads. And next time, as I say, if you want to see upgrades to this replica, I can do that, but I didn't feel that this replica particularly needs any upgrades at this time. I'm not looking to make it high speed or anything like that. I was going to do, but to be honest, I'm quite happy with it as is. So until it breaks, we'll keep it as is. Okay, well, thanks very much for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one.